I've got it.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Wonderful.
It might send the recording to me, in which case I will send it to you. Just because
Okay.
it's my Zoom. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
that
didn't
makes
do
a lot of sense. So basically, we want to do both an opening protocol and then also a closing protocol before we get into talking stories. And so the first part of that is just expressing gratitude that you have been able to take some time and space to talk with us. We are really excited to share space and talk story with you. And yeah, we're just incredibly grateful for this chance. So an overview of the project. The practice of talking stories refers to the way we are in relation with one another, where we make space and time for oral experience sharing. And using this framework, we seek out ways that scholars who place emphasis on centering marginal voices are approaching their work and praxis, essentially the story of themselves. To understand their relationship with time, place, space, and land, and have their organic responses add to the collective conversation of bringing people together. And like we had mentioned, this is super informal. There's no right or wrong. It's just creating a space for words and experiences and identities to exist. So part of our interview protocol of our own that we've been working on involves centering ourselves into the sacred space of talking stories. And we would like to start with who we are. So that would be our name, what we're studying, what program we're in, where we are from, and who we bring with us to this space. So we can start here, and then that can lead into a first general question, which is, who are you and where do you call home? And then we're just going to kind of see where the conversation goes. So I guess since I am the first person who is up just through speaking, I will start. So my name is Rachel James, and part of my name is self-given. I am from Polish background, Polish-German background out of the Midwest of the United States, mostly out of Missouri and Wisconsin. And who I bring with me into this space would be, I've really been sitting with the names of the women in my family who I don't know and their stories. And so as I approach my work, I'm constantly keeping them in mind. So I bring them into this space with me.
I'll go next. Thank you, Rachel, for starting us off. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you all. My name is Shione Lynn Peely-Lister. I am a third year PhD student in sociology. And I moved to Tucson from just outside of Seattle, Washington. My family is both from California and then also from the island of Utule in American Samoa. And I think for who I bring with us, I've had 3 different grandparents recently pass on in the past little bit of time, and from different sides of families, some birth and some not. And I'm just, calling them here with us today, and know that they will be really interested to hear how these stories go too.
Aloha kako o Kiana Lynn Makayan Anderson ko inoa no hilo waikea uka ahupua a mayau. My name is Kiana Lynn Makayan Anderson. I was born and raised on the Big Island of Hawaii in the Waikea Uka area, Hilo, Hawaii. And so a lot of my work is very much coming from that space and that culture. But my ancestors are all from all over the world, mostly the Philippines and Samoa, and from Europe. And I am also a PhD student in the literature department, studying like Asian American local identities, Pacific Islander, that realm. And who I'd like to bring to this space with me are all of my ancestors, particularly my Apo. He's been informing my work a lot lately since his passing, and I'd like to bring him and invite him into this space and honor him through these stories as well. So pleasure to be with you all, and I'm so excited to be doing this.
Well, thank you all. I really, I don't think I expressed it in my email because I was sort of just rapid answering, but thank you so much for this invitation to get to know you, to share space. And I really appreciate the way that you are sort of setting the tone of this conversation, both with your extremely thoughtful emails, which I am like a total wordsmith when I'm crafting emails, and I just kept thinking like, wow, they really put a lot of time and energy into this invitation, which I really appreciated, and also with the way that you're opening the space. So thank you very much. I am Anita Huizar-Hernández. I am an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, as you all know, at the University of Arizona. I call Arizona home. I'm one of those really fortunate folks who got to sort of come home, and it's really meaningful for me now because I have a daughter. And so in terms of people who are coming into the space with me, I was named after my great grandmother, Anita, who sort of raised my mom when she was really young, and my mom was really close to her, and her birthday was in early November, so she would have been 149 this year if she were still alive. And then that's my name, and that's my daughter's middle name, so we have sort of that multi-generational tie, which is great. And I love, and my family lives here as well. I self-identify as Chicana. Not everyone in my family does, but I do, and that's a different story for a different time. Lots of different relationships to what it means to be of Mexican descent in the United States today, and that's part of my story as well. Lots of different understandings of that kind of heritage. But yes, and it's beautiful to be able to be in a space where you have a lot of generations of family, even if it's messy and complicated. So that's who I'm bringing.
That's really beautiful, and thank you for sharing that with us. I love the like connection of your name between like all of you. It's just really fantastic. So going into our first question of like who you are and where do you call home, I actually think if you are wanting to go a bit into your self-identification of being Chicana, this would be a really interesting space, and could, I think, based off of also what I've read on your U of A profile, links a lot into your work. So just how you approach theory and praxis too.
Yes. Okay. So I self-identify as Chicana. For me, it's not just sort of an ethnic, racialized identity, but also a political identity and position, which is why I sort of alluded to the fact that not everyone in my family, including my parents, would be very comfortable or are very comfortable with me self-identifying as Chicana. That's been an impetus for my work. You know, I grew up some spaces that I was in through family were very much, I think, sort of whatever people think of as like typical Chicano spaces, and some very much not. And so sort of understanding the way that my immediate family was navigating those different spaces, why we felt more comfortable in some versus others, and then understanding Arizona as a space and how in some ways the state could build its identity off of this heritage that is very much connected to the extremely complex geopolitical cultural history of this place. You know, that even if you look at tourism brochures, it's clear that Arizona is trying to make an identity for itself that does acknowledge and recognize those, and then the cognitive dissonance of that. And you know, when I was in graduate school, SB 1070 passed, and that was the real watershed moment for a lot of the political organizing in the state. Not that there wasn't political organizing before that, but also for me personally, in terms of thinking about how we were legislating and trying to sort of fix a particular identity of who was Arizona that really didn't match up with even sort of the way that the state presented itself to other people in other places as to why you would want to come here. And so that sort of cognitive dissonance was really interesting to me. Because you all are graduate students, I'll share that was not at all what I wanted to study when I started graduate school. I never wanted to come back to Arizona, especially sort of becoming more political and understanding more about myself as a Chicana. I went to graduate school in Southern California. I wanted to stay in California. I felt like that was a better sort of space for what I wanted to do and who I wanted to be and who I understood myself to be. And then when SB 1070 passed, it was my second year of graduate school, and I was just starting to prepare for my exams. And I really dramatically shifted my research area to be on my home state of Arizona instead, because I felt that there was not sufficient academic inquiry, and now relating to sort of theory and praxis of Arizona, that people didn't really take it seriously as a place. It felt sort of like a footnote or an afterthought, that people had really looked at California, they had looked at Texas, they had looked at New Mexico. They hadn't looked at Arizona in the same way. And even when I brought it up to members of my committee, they were like, well, yeah, because no one's ever done anything there. Like, no one's ever written anything, or like, it's a, like, you know. So it seemed like a place that was very misunderstood. And it became especially clear to me in terms of theory and praxis as when SB 1070 passed. I was in Southern California, and people were talking about the state from a critical perspective from the left as like, oh, people from Arizona are, or Arizona is, in this way that felt really equally dismissive and like equally mischaracterizing the complexity of the organizing. I think it's not that way anymore because of how much national attention the state has gotten since then, and the kind of organizing that's happening that's now more sort of legible beyond the state's borders. But I became really interested, especially in that period of time, sort of around the U.S.-Mexico War through the Arizona statehood. So like the mid to late 19th century, early 20th century, and thinking about how were suddenly all of these different cultures and countries colliding with each other. And of course thinking of like Mexico coming from Spain as its own like colonizing force, and all of those complicating factors. If we could go back and look at that time period more seriously, do some archival work, what would we find, and how would that potentially shift the dynamics of the conversations that were happening about the present, and our understanding about the present? I'm very historically minded, as you all know from my profile and what you may have read, but I always get confused when people sort of react to me like, oh, but you're sort of talking about the present. It's like, well, yeah, why else would you talk about the past? So I'm very, very in line with that Faulkner quote of, the past is never dead, it's not even past. That is very motivating, I think, for all of my work. And I feel like I'm rambling, but the last thing I'll say about theory and praxis, I found theory really difficult and alienating when I was in graduate school, especially at the beginning. I almost dropped out of graduate school after the first quarter just because I like wasn't getting it. I didn't come from like an Ivy League background. I went to ASU for undergrad. I had never encountered theory before graduate school. Everyone else seemed to already like be conversant in like, Foucault and Marx and Althusser, and I've never heard of any of these people except for Marx. And I was like, what? Are we taking this person seriously? So it was really confusing for me until we got further into it, and then encountering Chicana feminism, and sort of, I really appreciate the way that you guys are centering story, and the way that those theoretical contributions were presented, that made a lot more sense to me. And theory is, I have like a love-hate relationship. It's something that I've struggled with a lot. I think it's really useful. I had sort of a knee-jerk, like total rejection, I think, reaction to it at first, which makes sense. But then I've come to like a more nuanced, I think, understanding of like, and I'm saying theory in this blanket way, of course, it's very complicated. There's lots of different contributions, but sort of navigating different registers of language has been a journey for me, especially as you're applying those different registers to situations in which those registers feel really uncomfortable for a variety of reasons that I'm sure you all can understand. So that's been something really interesting. And then, okay, the final thing I'll say about theory, that's very difficult if you work on the past, if you're interested in marginalized voices, is really grappling with the materials that we have and what we can do with those materials. There were multiple points after I decided to write about Arizona, and the archival record is slim in the state in terms of marginalized voices. There were multiple points at which I thought, like, what is the point? Why am I even working with these records? Like, what am I doing? Can we do anything? What is available to us, right? And then, fortunately, I encountered like Sadia Hartman and all these people doing amazing work. I wish that I, was that level of brilliant writer. I so admire people whose work crosses sort of like fiction and like non-fiction scholarship, because I think there is like a need for that, and that we have to imagine, critical fabulation, as Hartman would call it, like that we really do need those other tools to sort of fill that in. And really late in my career, I came to archival studies, and that was just so transformative for me as well, to think about the way that these archivists who are, having to deal with the records and processing it, have all of these just like incredible frameworks to approach the record, right? And what we do with that, and thinking about space and time in these totally different ways in terms of like the continuum of the record. And it just blew my mind. And the sort of way that we are interdisciplinary, and everyone is sort of like interdisciplinarily inclined, and yet everyone has their sort of like go-to theorists that then end up informing the practice. And you sort of like group yourselves along certain lines. And it's been really amazing and enriching to encounter that body of scholarship that was not something that I was exposed to in graduate school, or even that many people, this is changing, but that many people in my area who even do a lot of archival work necessarily engage with. Michelle Caswell has this really great article called "The Archive is Not an Archives," or "The Archives is Not an Archive," talking about the difference between the way humanists talk about like the archive with a capital A, and the way archival studies scholars approach actual archives, and just sort of the way that archival studies has not been engaged with, right, by people who are thinking through the archive. I've learned a lot from Jamie Lee. If you all have already talked with them in the iSchool, amazing archival studies scholar. We were really fortunate to co-teach an SCCT spring class on the politics of the archives, which was fantastic. I mean, it's just wonderful to be able to learn from other people. And I think that is, to close my really rambly, I don't know what you're going to be able to do with this kind of recording, but that really, I think, helps me personally at least navigate theory, is learning it through other people, which is the way that we always learn it, but sometimes it's more palpable than others, right?
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said about theory giving you like being able to hear, access a register of voices, or and like having that be a place where it kind of maybe helps unlock ways, or like not to say produces new stories, because stories have always been there, but to really like engage with them in different ways, and see them and experience them on a different level. And I really appreciate that, because I think for the three of us, story is really kind of key to a lot of our studies. And so that's a really interesting way of like uniting theory and storytelling, which is great, because it goes into, and you've hit on this a bit already, how do you view the role of storytelling in your work? And something, I mean, that's its own question, and something that I'm interested in that you said about storytelling was about this like necessary sort of intersection and entanglement between storytelling and critical work.
Yes. So I'm a literary critic by training. And so stories are, I mean, it's what drew me to academia. It's fundamental to the way that I approach everything, and that is my contribution or my approach to the wider field of border studies, which is what I was hired into for this particular job. So I'm really interested, and I think it's very necessary for us to think about the way that the stories that circulate around different ideas or places end up defining and shaping those places. So, for example, the US Mexico border is, in many senses, more of a story than it is an actual place. And that is something that really unites and unifies, all of my work, right? That most people don't actually think of this particular line or where it is, as opposed to, what it means and the stories they've heard about the people, or the stories they haven't heard about the people that line impacts. So in that sense, I find storytelling really urgent and necessary, and I find couching it in that way really urgent and necessary because it is simultaneously sort of disconcerting that something that we think of as like firm in whatever way is actually shaped by this cacophony of stories, and this very uneasy balance of stories that sort of compete for attention on different sides. But I also find it really hopeful because stories can change and we can have a role in changing those stories and in bringing attention to different stories. And sometimes, especially when I was in graduate school, I would feel like, I should go do something real, right? Or like, I came to it from a social justice perspective. I really wanted to make concrete change. And at various points, it was really difficult for me to see what that concrete change could be or would be, from my position of privilege in the academy and like grappling with that. Like, can you, and there's still a lot of questions and for me personally about that. And yet I do strongly believe that making people aware of the stories that sort of like actually end up shaping their actions and their attitudes and their behaviors towards places and towards people is really urgent and necessary and important, and empowering people to say that their stories matter and that their stories can change things is equally urgent and important. And I really do believe that as a literary critic and as a teacher, and as an activist. So that is really important to me. I have now a few different like public facing storytelling projects that are going on, and that whole idea of really wanting to reframe stories of folks who are crossing that border and coming here for various reasons, is important to me and powerful, I think.
I feel like this is a good space to talk about how you see your relationship to land, and then come back to another question, just because you mentioned the space of the borderlands being a very like unique and alive space, and that's deeply attached to the land that we are in right now. So yeah, how do you see your relationship with land?
This is such a complicated question and something that really is still evolving for me. I'm hyper aware of being a light-skinned Latina, Chicana. I'm hyper aware of being part of many different sides of the colonization of this particular space. And so my relationship to land is really wanting to honor the different stories that have shaped this land, and to also make this, do whatever I can through the work that I have, which is as I get deeper into my career, I think mostly amplifying the voices of other people and like activating the privilege that I have to lend my skills to amplifying the voices of other people to make this space a land where there that where the sort of calculus of who belongs is totally different, and where people think about belonging in a more complex way. And I don't just mean like the people who wrote SB 1070 and like not being racist against migrants from different places, right? Like that maybe is what I thought, probably was what I thought when I first started my project in graduate school, but making, you know, all of us like Chicanos who have an Aztlan kind of claim to the land, like complicating that as well, right? Like really thinking through, you know, Arizona being a place with, you know, over 20 federally recognized tribal nations, right? Like what does that mean for all of us coming to this as scholars, and how does that history play out? You know, I have a newish project that I've been working on the Gadsden Purchase and or the Tratado de la Mesilla, which cut the O'Atum land in half, and yet like they weren't even party to the treaty, right? And so how does that all fit into the way that we think about this land, approach this land, and talk about this land, right? Like I'm very mindful of the temporality of the way that people talk about Arizona, and it's something that I struggle with when I teach classes, right? Because on the one hand, students love chronology, like who doesn't? It's very comforting. And yet it's extremely insidious and dangerous to teach a class where it's like, here is the indigenous past, and then the Spanish and Mexican past, and then the Anglo present and future, right? And complicating that for students and making sure that that's not what they're getting, and keeping all of these sort of different trajectories alive and interconnected and moving in these really dynamic ways can be a challenge with the format of like a syllabus and 16 weeks and these sort of, but there's lots of different ways that we can complicate that for students, and they're exciting, and that is what excites me as an instructor, right? Is having them complicate not just like what is Arizona, but how can we even think about any place, and when we're on land in a particular place, like how do we situate ourselves in relationship to that?
I think that's like an incredibly beautiful answer. And I really appreciate the way that like you not only hold these tensions and hold these like complications and these like beautiful parts of what makes Arizona a state and all these identities, but also the way that you like articulate them in your work. And just now with us, like, even going through our questions, like I'm looking at them like, oh wow, you've already addressed this. It's really, really cool because this is at the forefront of your mind all the time, and I can tell.
Yeah.
So you mentioned temporality and chronology, and this goes into our last question, which is, you know, you've already kind of answered this, but I'm not sure if maybe there's space for you to expand on it. If that is, maybe discussing like, how do we do this within a syllabus? But the last question is, how do you approach space and time within your work?
So maybe one way to talk about it would be through my book. So in that, I was looking at I mean, it's really all about like land and stories and space and time. So that particular project was about a con artist who was named James Rivas, and he decided that he was going to make up a Spanish land grant and then present it to the U.S. Court of Land Claims to try to steal like most of central Arizona and a small sliver of New Mexico. So it would have been an enormous amount of territory. The way that he, which is interesting, and there's like historical studies of sort of the nitty gritty who, what, when, where, why of this particular case. But I was really interested in, you know, what does this mean that this man in the 1800s would try to rewrite history, and like what were the mechanics of that, and how did he get people to think about property ownership in this land that they were living on in these wildly different ways. So what he did is he forged all these archives around the world, in Spain and Mexico and the United States, to invent, you know, a person who was this Baron of Arizona, and invent a whole lineage, and then take a woman who he then presented as the only living heiress to this, marry that woman, and then claim this like whole fictitious land grant and story through her. And so he presented it in this very straightforward chronological way. Like first there was this baron and he did the service to the Spanish crown, and then, but the way that it was actually happening was not at all like that, right? In terms of chronology, like there was just this guy who was sort of like one-off, forging these various archives, making up the story as he went along, adding to it. Then you have also this woman who, you know, speaking of archives that are very limited and restricted, we don't know that much about, but was likely the daughter of an indigenous woman and an Anglo man, but had been orphaned, and presenting her as a Spaniard. And then when it comes out that this claim is all fictitious, then the way that the press reacts to her and racializes her, where at first she was this like white, wealthy Spanish baroness, she was received at the court in Spain, and then she becomes, you know, all of these like horrific racialized terms that are like extremely gendered, extremely racialized, right? About where she came from, who she was, and then like describing her behavior in these ways. So it's a complicated story. I feel like I didn't do a great job of explaining what it was, but I was so drawn to this case because all of these, you know, topics that are so interesting to me, like how story informs place, how chronology like functions within those stories and informs like things like legal ownership of land, and like even like political dynamics and things like that. They were all there and present in this particular story, and that's what I was so interested in. And then looking at like fictional kind of reimaginings of it, and how depending on the time period, you know, they would racialize her name was Sophia in these various ways, or even change her name. In one novel, she ends up getting recast as like the granddaughter of Cochise. And so like what people want to tie these kind of like floating signifiers of different histories to, and like how they want to activate them in various moments. And then thinking about how currently, even though this was big news at the time, and it was you know, picked up by the Wire press, and so, you know, it was like people in St. Louis were reading about this case, for example. But now it's been, you know, more or less forgotten to history. And so thinking about why that is, and like what kinds of like counter histories and alternate approaches are sort of present within this particular case that can make us think about Arizona in these different ways. So that's one. That was my monograph. Also, if you have any questions on that, I'm happy to answer them. Another quick different example, because that's sort of not that it's like in my past, but that was that project. And so in terms of things that I'm working on right now, I've become really I have tenure now, which is, you know, great. And so now I can do whatever I want. I don't have to just write monographs, which is great because I really, really like to work with other people in teams, and I really like to do public facing work. And I'm really interested in digital tools and how they can play with like chronology, especially, and place in these different ways. And so I am by no means an expert, but getting really excited about and interested in GIS and in the different possibilities of mapping. So I have this other project where I'm working with a team of undergraduate students and a graduate student to try to map the narrative of Cabeza de Vaca, who was part of this failed Spanish expedition. So he like shipwrecked in Florida and wandered over to like roughly here, and then collided with the Spaniards again, sort of totally by accident. And he was wandering for 8 years. And so, you know, the narrative is completely unreliable. Like he's writing it for these very specific reasons. And yet it's interesting in terms of like an entrance into the mindset of someone who was part of the Spanish colonial enterprise and like had a very particular positionality within that. Which is fine and interesting. But what I really like about GIS and what I find so interesting in terms of like creating multiple layers to a map is the way that you can destabilize the sort of centrality of, for example, a colonial narrative, right? So you can use these tools which are like impossible to make chronological, right? Because like people encounter these maps and are like clicking around in these ways that you can't really anticipate. And then, can have multiple, because maps are just representations of perspectives, right? So like you can have multiple perspectives in tension with each other in terms of, what were the different indigenous communities at that time, as far as we know, or more importantly to me, right, today, like where are those lands, or where's the contested land, or what are the different language families or religions, food systems, environmental degradation in that particular area, right? You can pull in all of this data from giant spreadsheets, and then you can visualize it in these really interesting ways. And depending on who's using the map, right, like they can filter out data. And it's just this like really dynamic tool to put sort of like totally different worldviews and ways of experiencing land and approaching land together. I don't have the technical expertise for this. So like my interest and my like the theoretical stakes of what I'm wanting to do are like light years ahead of what I can actually do, which is like create 3 points on a map. But that's one of the great things about academia, right? Is like we have our whole lives to continue to learn and to encounter new things. And something that I'm coming to more, and this is amazing to me that you all are like already working in a team. I was not that savvy when I was just in my early graduate school, but like the power of teams and of really respecting other people's knowledge bases. I think at a certain point, I really felt like I personally needed to like become expert in everything. And like I needed to learn all these languages, and like I needed to be able to like navigate all of these different disciplines and areas. And you like, to a certain extent, yes, you need to have enough understanding to be able to negotiate those different spaces. But also we can do so much more when we work together. And I learned so much about how we can think about things in more complex ways, and sort of what's out there from really not just reading someone's work, which I of course have always done and love to do, right? Like I love to read an article or a book, or attend a talk, but to actually try to produce something together. Like we're going to make this map together, and then whatever we're making is this like collage of perspectives. And so that is something that I'm really excited about, and I'm teaching a class on it in the spring, which I'm like really nervous about because I like don't know what I'm doing, and all these geoscience undergrads have signed up for it, and like, they're definitely going to know more than I do. But at the same time, I'm hoping that like bringing this humanities GIS perspective will be really valuable to all these like engineering and geoscience students that are signing up, just so that we think about, the situatedness of data. And just because it's in a spreadsheet doesn't mean that it didn't come from somewhere. And like really interrogating when we look at a map, what is it actually showing us, right? Or like who is it actually showing us, more importantly. So I'm really nervous and excited about this kind of new direction.
I just want to say that sounds like a really amazing class. Where is it going to be housed?
So right now it's going to be in the Honors College. It's like a small honors humanities lab, but my goal is to have it be a gen ed. I don't know if you all know that like gen ed is going through like a major kind of overhaul at U of A right now. So they aren't accepting new classes yet. But my goal is for it to become a large gen ed, because one, I think it's like the goal of gen ed to get these students with different perspectives to sort of do exactly what I'm saying, right? Like work in these teams and understand how they can approach complex topics together. And I really want all these students, especially who are interested in like colonial history or big data, to have this kind of like decolonial mindset going in, or to at least to have encountered it, right? And to be aware of what's at stake in the kind of work that they're being asked to do and to think about. So hopefully it'll be a gen ed someday. Right now it's going to be like a 10% little like practice lab thing.
That's so cool. Ages ago in my undergrad, when I was first thinking about grad school, I was really interested in possibly applying to geography and doing like a geospatial sort of like mapping of story and identity in America, like the American myth and where that comes from. But I was like, wow, I do not have the tools or the background to like support that project. But I think it's a really cool way to kind of humanize a science or a field that like we kind of like hold into this sort of objective space that doesn't have any kind of bias to it, which is not at all true. So I don't know, I think that's a really interesting like class. I think that's going to be a great thing.
Well, we'll see. I think it'll be like the journey is the destination, because I'm not sure what the actual map will look like by by the end of it. But I mean, because we're working, historical GIS, I think is always like this, but because we're working with an unreliable source from the beginning, like we know the map that we're making is not representing where people actually went or what they actually did, which I think in some cases is like, well, then why are you doing it? But in other cases, is similar in that vein to my book. I guess this is what I'm drawn to, is like extreme versions that illustrate a point that I think is like underlying a larger reality, right? So like, okay, sure, we know that like he was lost for 8 years, and so like how could we possibly plot like the exact lat long coordinates for where he was when he didn't even know where he was? And yet, isn't that what we're always doing when we're like trying to pinpoint something exactly? And even if you do know that it happened in that exact spot, like what does that even mean? Like if two people are in the exact spot at the exact same time, like are they having the same experience? Like why do we put so much value on that particular thing? Or like what meaning are we supposed to derive from that? I do think we can derive meaning from that, but is the meaning we currently derive the correct meaning of like totally transparent, like immediately obvious kind of objective reality?
I think that's really great. Shione, Kiana, do y'all want to like go into any of these details, or do we want to like start talking about our closing protocol, which is bringing space for what we like appreciate about this conversation and this talk story? Part of our closing protocol, just like our opening protocol, is really just kind of like centering the space that we've made here with you, and just like what you've gifted us in terms of your time and your knowledge. Excuse me, I have the driest throat. And so part of our closing ceremony is to go around and just talk about, oh, Kiana's computer, is your computer frozen? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay, so she's gonna text us and we will see. But while she's doing that, I'll just talk a bit about our closing protocol, and what we want to do is to just like go around and share what we are taking from this space, what we've appreciated about this space, and what we're gonna like hold on to in our continuing journeys in grad school and knowledge. 1 second, I think Kiana just texted. Okay.
She can't type either in the chat.
Complications. Okay. Oh, gotcha. Kiana, is there a way for you to reset or call and speak over?
Yeah, you could call in if you want to try that.
Okay, well, I guess while Kiana is doing that, technology. I guess, do you have anything further, Shione, or do you, Anita, like, do you have anything that you would like to talk about with us?
My thoughts, I think, will basically go into our closing protocol, which is just like, because I'm just sitting in like so much like gratitude and awe for what you shared with us. So I'm taking away a lot. I kind of mentioned this in the chat, but I've used GIS and I've learned, like, I know a lot of faculty. You might know Daniel Martinez. He works, and so I work, or he's one of my advisors. And so I know a lot of scholarship that uses GIS, and I am really interested in like decoloniality and colonialism, and ever had like anyone talk about using something kind of that I consider like a more quant focused like software like GIS in this like super fascinating and powerful way, because we already know that maps are tools of colonialism. So like thinking about how we can like use kind of like reverse that process is just so cool. I've already like jotted down people to forward like your name to who are doing GIS stuff so that they can like think about how they might do it in a less sociological way and more a little bit better, in my opinion, way. So yeah, I love everything you shared. I'm so grateful, and I don't have really any follow-up questions, just like I am really fascinated by this and will think about it a lot for a while.
Well, like I said, I'm not at all an expert, but I'm really interested in the way that we can use these, like you said, quant tools to sort of like speak back again, because they're sort of, I mean, they're just tools, right? And so we have these stories about them and what they show us and what they do, but I'm interested in using them in these totally different ways that suddenly make us rethink, like, what is a map, right? So the things that we talk about, I think, a lot as humanists, especially if you're talking about colonialism, but showing it to students, and in my experience, limited experience, having them play around with things is just a really different way to approach it. Another project that I have is sort of the same, but with archives. We're doing a really big public-facing digital archive of oral histories of people that were formerly held in immigration detention in Arizona, and it's a partnership with the Florence Project, which is the sole provider of free legal and social services to immigrants in Arizona. And so, like, same thing there in terms of, we know that the archival record is really limited. We know that these stories of what folks are experiencing are like purposefully being erased in real time. And even like, what was happening during COVID and in the detention centers, like the corporations that run them are really savvy at making sure that this never is documented. And so there again, I'm like really interested in thinking about how we can, like use community archives or work in partnership with different nonprofit organizations and advocacy organizations to sort of record these other stories and like on people's own terms, right? So like, how do you even approach an oral history in that sense? And yeah, we're like including some artwork that people have created in detention, and then like how do you create metadata that is like, how do you create metadata in collaboration with folks so that it's not just like a taxonomy of their experience, or not reduced to like, maybe things that like researchers would be interested in terms of their experience, but like how do folks want to tell their own stories, and like how do they want them to be like literally tagged and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm really interested in how these digital tools allow us to sort of highlight and rethink like knowledge and the way that we organize it.
Kiana, are you back?
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
I called in. Okay, cool. I just called in from my phone. Thank you so much, like, for just talking with us. Like, these answers were just so beautiful and nuanced, and it makes me excited to see like what's to come for the future, and even kind of bringing it back to our own work. Like, this is really inspiring to think about, because so much of what brought us together is the idea of story and storytelling. And I really appreciated how you kind of offered this new perspective that I think we kind of like have been circling back to, but like this concept of layering, So like working within this chronology of time, but almost like disrupting that through these multiple like multimedia, like the layering of story. And then that kind of brings in the exclusions or what is being left out, or creating a version of the past that would account for like these exclusions. And so like to some degree, it's like a type of like futurism almost, that we are creating and imagining a past that was erased and sought to be like continue to be erased. So that's very, very inspiring, and something that I'll continue to think about too, with like the dissemination of story and how can we kind of manipulate that to account for these atrocities that history has like left out. And that is like super, super cool. So I'm excited to see how that project like turns out in terms of like the data and the mapping, and what stories have to offer in the in between of that. So thank you so much. I also really appreciated you kind of just recognizing that whenever we work with the past, that becomes difficult when dealing with theory. And I think that's something that we get a lot of like pushback from whenever, especially like even with this project, it was kind of difficult to even like propose it within this space, because it, to some degree, it just kind of seemed like out there, you know, like there's no like methodology that we're going about, like we're kind of like circling around stories. But this just really affirmed our goal, and that it matters, and that stories matter, and our stories intersecting matters. So I just wanted to say thank you, and I'm so grateful. And sorry, my computer froze.
That's totally fine. No worries whatsoever. I'm always having technical difficulties. So, but thank you so much, all of you, for creating this space. And I'm so excited to see your work as it develops. And yeah, I'm so excited about the work that is happening now, and sort of the way that people are challenging boundaries, and like you said, like what's accepted and what's expected. And really exciting, great stuff is coming from that, right?
Thank you so much for this. It's deeply appreciated.
Well, thank you all for the invitation. I really appreciate it. I hope that I, get to see more of you in the future. So I am involved with SCCT, so maybe I'll see you at a talk or something like that.
Maybe at some point in the future, when you have this general education class, you'll just have a bunch of grad students who descend upon it and are just like very excited for it.
Yes, we'll see. I have a lot to learn before it can be a gen ed, I think. But yeah, I'm really excited. I love to work with undergraduate students. I mean, I love graduate students as well, but some people prefer like one or the other. Yeah, all students at different levels. It's just super energizing. I think I enjoy stories, and I enjoy different perspectives, and that I love the way that they always surprise me.
Well, thank you, and I hope you have a fabulous rest of your day.
You too, and I think I'm going to receive this recording, so I will forward it to you all.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day.